thank you for being here today with us, Professor Ruggeri. It's a real pleasure for us to host you and ask you different questions.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
First of all, we would like to have a brief introduction of yourself, of your role, and of course of your main research, what it's about, and what first drew you to study international relations and conflict when you were a student, I guess.
So, well, hello. I am a professor of political science now at the University of Milan, Statale, but I was 10 years professor of international relations at the University of Oxford, where I was director of the Center for International Studies. And Oxford came after Amsterdam, Amsterdam after Essex, Essex after Paris. So I've been traveling a bit. But I did my BA in international relations at the University of Geneva. So I studied politics since my first degree, and my decision to study international politics and conflict, I would say, came with my first year at the University of Geneva. That was the year of the 9/11, so it was 2001. And after that, we had the occupation of Afghanistan and then Iraq 2003. So I think those years, I was already interested in politics, but those years were the years that they made me think that studying international politics, conflict prevention and conflict resolution were extremely important topics.
Yeah, probably also some similarities to our period. In your view, so since the expertise is very broad, we would like to start from a conflict matter that is ongoing right now. And so, in your opinion, what are the most essential steps and confidence building measures required to achieve a lasting and just peace between Ukraine and Russia, and how can the international community best support this process?
So first, we have to say that not all peace are lasting and all peace are just. So you can have a lasting peace that is unjust or a just peace that is not lasting. So we want to be very careful on that. And so for thinking about this, and we can think about Ukraine and Russia, we can think about the 50-something ongoing conflict around the world, because we are at the highest peak of conflict, mostly civil war, since 1946, though now we are very focused substantively on Ukraine and Russia. So a lasting peace is a peace where there is a sort of management of the so-called commitment problem. So the issue is, why should I trust the other that would not use weapons? So the core element is trust and commitment. So how can you resolve commitment? Well, you can resolve commitment in different ways. One way is to actually put a buffer between the belligerents, that is basically a buffer area, that is a neutral area with deployment of military or peacekeepers. There are also other elements, such as the possibility to create economic interdependence. So actually, rather than looking only at the security matter, also economic deals. This is, of course, very hard to resolve and to implement. There is also the core aspect of deterrence. So it's commitment, but it's also deterrence. So in the case of Ukraine, for instance, what would deter Russia to invade again if there is a ceasefire or peace agreement? And here we open up an enormous possibility. Goes from making extremely costly to reoccupy, re-attack Ukraine. And one way would be to create a sort of iron nest where basically the Ukrainian have such a high military capability that is extremely costly. Then there are the other way. One is to put Ukraine within NATO and therefore be within the Article 5, that in case that Russia invade Ukraine, would trigger a coalition attack. Or you can also not put it within NATO, but create a stronger military army in the European Union to basically deter a possibility, a second degree deterrence. There is also the nuclear umbrella. So these are all options. One of the problems that we tend to conflate as if they were one. About the just peace, that's extremely difficult, because because it's about basically repayment of war, it's about transitional justice. So, who committed war crimes, what we have to do with that. And so, I have to say that often there is almost a trade off between just and lasting.
Very interesting view. And according to you, I mean, what does history, because you also talk about rearmament of Ukraine and NATO, and I think that in Europe we often talk about this. So what does history teach us about the saying civis pacem para bellum, and in this case, is European rearmament truly necessary today? Do you see some parallels with pre-World War I arms race also in this sense?
Now, there are different elements here. What history can teach us? Okay, history can teach us a lot, but also historical analogies can make major mistakes. So I'm very careful to use history as an experiment. So, and the problem of comparability is enormous. So we want to be very careful. Civis pacem para bellum, it is something that is used often. However, we want to be careful also in this concept because, as you said, the red line between deterrence and arms race and a spiral model. So basically, one is you get armaments and you deter the other to attack you. But the other position is you signal that you have willingness to be offensive, and therefore you have a competition of armament. This red line is very thin. So what that means? It means that indeed military deterrence is important, but without diplomatic mediation, without communication, the level and risk of misinterpretation of other behavior is enormous. This is a classic from Jervis on how to misinterpret behavior of the others. So in this case, and if we still think about Ukraine and Russia, I think that indeed is important that the European Union has a long plan that is Readiness 2030. It is important because rather being reactive is proactive. Remember that during the first months of the Russian occupation of Ukraine, we as European Union published something called Strategic Compass. There was a document to think about military how to behave. And the maximum capability we were thinking was a fast deployment of 5,000 troops. Now these numbers are ridiculous compared to what we want to do and the 500 billion investment. So I think that Readiness 2030 has some very important aspects, but is very military as security rather than thinking security more broadly. And another aspect, as Italian, and maybe not just as Italian European, this project, the way we are thinking, is very Eastern flank. So we are really focused on what's going on, rightly so, in our eastern side. But of course, if we think about migration, if we think about climate change, if we think about other dynamics in sub-Saharan Africa, the southern flank, the Mediterranean flank, is extremely important. And it's quite absent in the white paper of the European Union.
Thank you very much. In this sense, you also talked about diplomatic synthesis that must be done to arrive to some. I mean, deterrence is not enough, and it's a thin line. And in this sense, so what role, if any, do any military tools, non-military tools such as foreign aid, cultural exchange, economic partnership, in a sense, diplomatic work, could play in preventing conflict?
So the way that I think analytically we have to think is how you can prevent a war, how you can stop a war, and how you can have a lasting peace. These are three very different elements. So now we have to stop the war. And stopping the war is making it extremely costly. So it means also having military support, but also stressing economically what we have lost, and therefore providing opportunity of economic interdependence and, for instance, reconstruction. In order to do that, as I said, we need a lot of mediation. A lot of the points you made were how to prevent a war. So basically, there are elements of exchange that are a movement of people and socialization of different norms in order to debug myth on evilness of the others. You mentioned also aid, that is extremely important. Aid is also about how to have a lasting peace. Notice that the current American administration, Trump administration, has been trying to destroy one of the most important aid agency that is USAID. This agency was created by Kennedy in the 60s. And his idea was that the hegemon, or the wannabe hegemon in a moment of bipolarity, could not fight the war and the Cold War with the Soviet without also soft power. So the idea was we need military power, but we need also a carrot in order to provide development, but also some aspect of loyalty with other countries. So, and it is interesting that it seems that in this debate now, we are only mostly focusing on the military aspect. Whereas, as you said, aid, social exchanges, but I would say also economic interdependence is a major aspect. Not all economic interdependence is good, because as we know, the energy dependence that Italy had and Germany had toward Russia most likely was a major element to make Putin think that we would be passive and not reactive.
Thank you very much. So still coming on energy and climate change in the sense we wanted to take from that. As climate change already led to some conflicts so far, do you think it will become increasingly probable as a trigger of disputes in fragile states that are most targeted by climate change in the future?
So there is nowadays a large scientific literature on climate change and conflict. The argument is whether is a second degree effect. So basically climate change affect, for instance, food shortages, affect movement of people, and these in turn affect conflict escalation. Or there is also first level effect where the climate change influence individual behavior. Most of the evidence is on the first aspect, so the second degree effect. And we do have studied that there is inter-community village violence between, for instance, individual having agriculture shortages and also the management of natural resources, such as especially water. So yes, indeed, climate change is going to be a major driver of possible conflict. It's going to be a major driver of forced displacement. So we are at the peak again. We are facing a lot of peaks in this historical moment. We are at peak historically of forced displacement. That means refugees and internally displaced people. There is a new figure that is the climate refugee. So individuals that they are not leaving because there is a war, or they're not leaving for economic reason, but they have to leave to survive because the climate is too harsh to stay in their original place. So the way we think about relation conflict and climate change, we think about civil war, we think about border escalation of a river, but there will be also other dynamics. For instance, massive migration that will create tension, not only in sub-Saharan Africa, not only in the southern shore of the Mediterranean, but also will have a massive pressure on us.
Thank you very much. So in your perspective, what recent world event do you find most interesting from a political science point of view?
So unfortunately, we are in a very challenging times that many things are happening. So one major event that we are witnessing and we are all stuck as international community is what's happening in Gaza. That it is a very thorny issue. in the sense of polarization also between society in the West, but clearly in terms of pace, in terms of violence, is one of the largest mass atrocities and ethnic cleansing, and we can use the European Union definition of ethnic cleansing as a strategic homogenization of a territory in order to occupy it. And this is happening very close to us. So this is, I think, one of the major aspects that we will have to study, why we didn't manage to prevent it. And this will have major implication in the future in the Middle East, and not just in the Middle East. So I think Gaza is an enormous aspect. We have also other elements that, for instance, we have reached one of the highest peak of civil wars since 1946, but this trend that was declining in the early 2000 went up again in 2003, and now we are the highest. But this is mostly due to a different form of civil war, that is the so-called internationalized civil war. So there are civil wars where there are domestic actors fighting each other, and then there are external actors supporting it. I think we still have very little study about that, and political science should do much better. Also because most of the countries supporting externally civil war, actually the top 5 in the last 10 years are the same. They are the permanent member of the UN Security Council. So we have a shortcut, a tension between the conflict going up and those that have the veto power in the Security Council to stop it, that via money, via weapons, and via training, they are supporting somehow the civil war. I think these are two major aspects. The fact that we are unable to stop mass atrocity, the fact that the international architecture, main actors, they should stop civil war, are also supporting civil war. And then, of course, there is, I think, one of the major issues that we have to focus now, that is the return of nationalism. That in a moment that we have to focus on global public goods, so things that you can tackle only if you act collectively, climate change, massive migration and demographic changes, new technological aspects that are transnational, that can be only tackled not by one country, but by a collective action of country. In the same moment that we face these challenges, now nationalism is back. That is pushing us to think actually as a single country rather than international community. And so there is this paradox that those that should be the leader to coordinate are actually the leader that for electoral success, they think about not coordination, not cooperation, and putting forward nationalism. If I were a new scholar with writing a thesis or writing a PhD proposal, I think this would be 3 terrific topics.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.